right, so last week I decided to try something different and asked you all to submit questions to me if it would be interesting to hear what I had to say and what my responses would be for some of those questions. And I didn't really have any expectations. If you wanted to send in questions, great. If that wasn't something you want to do, that's okay too. Again, I'm just looking for ways to have fun conversation about cards and have a fun time and kind of get in dialogue and connecting with people. So I'm open to whatever. And I asked for your feedback, and most people gave me positive feedback and said, yeah, let's do this. Keep doing this somewhat regularly. So what I decided is I'm going to try to do this once a week. And it's going to be midlife, midweek questions, right? My midlife cards, right? It's midweek, midway through the week. Let's answer some questions. So as long as people continue to submit questions to me to ask, I will continue to pick some of those questions and answer them in a midlife, midweek question and answer. Now, again, I'm not trying to, for a second, suggest that I'm always right or that I have all the answers, but these are my opinions, and I want to hear your opinions if you agree or don't agree, so that I can get a better idea of what you guys think, because maybe you'll convince me of something different. I'm definitely open to any of these ideas out there. And a lot of people have made some great comments that have made me think differently about some things. So give me feedback. Again, in the comments below, do me a favor. And if you have a question that you want to ask me to have me answer next week or the week after or whenever there's some interest, then put it down there so I can get back to you in this video format and continue our discussion and back and forth about this hobby. All right? So let's go ahead and read the very first question for this week. All right. Do you think in the near future SGC will pass PSA for number one if they start, or when they start, their set registry they've been talking about? All right, so I want to do this a little bit differently this time too. Before I answer that question, I'm going to show you a clock over my shoulder. And the clock is going to have a countdown timer, sort of like Pardon the Interruption on ESPN. I'm only going to have a certain amount of time to answer this because I know that sometimes I might get long-winded and kind of go on little tangents. So this will kind of keep us going and keep us on track. So I'm putting up on the clock right now 2 minutes. And for each answer, I'm going to do my best to articulate my opinion to the question in 2 minutes. So let's go ahead and start that timer. Now, I believe that I don't think SGC in the short term is going to catch PSA. Can they eventually? They could, but they're going to have to be very strategic. Here's the problem if you're SGC. So many of the very nicest cards are in PSA holders already. Because PSA had this head start, because they were the leader for the first 25 years, a lot of people have already submitted cards for grading and they're in holders. And most of them are in PSA holders. So in order to catch PSA, even if you have a set registry, your set registry would have too many cards in PSA holders. So nobody's asking me for advice, but if I was consulting with SGC, here's what I would suggest. I would say, hey, if you have a card that is in a high-end grade, we think that SGC's the best company, and we think you're realizing this too. So what we want to do for you is for basically at cost, switch it from a PSA grade to an SGC grade. Obviously, it would have to meet SGC standards, but if they were to do that and get some of those cards that are in PSA holders into SGC holders, and now a bunch of the good cards out there are all in SGC holders, I think they'd have a better chance of catching them. All right, which unpopular cards will become popular in the future? For example, hockey, movie, golf, celebrities, music cards, etc. That is definitely an interesting one because I personally have a huge interest in this kind of stuff. All right, another really good question. What do I think about some non-sport stuff and some of the smaller, less popular cards? What's going to happen to their value? Now, here's one of the things I was trying to get at last week in the video that I posted about the junk wax era and the junk wax collectors. Those of us that grew up in the 80s and in the 90s, we look at sports cards as a way to collect things that we like. We're used to collecting cards. So to us, a card or an autograph is one thing that you could collect from something that you like. So a lot of us have collected cards, we understand cards, and we say, oh, Star Wars cards? Yeah, of course I would collect cards. You don't have to convince us that cards are collectibles because we've already experienced that. So I think as a lot of the junk waxer collectors come back into the market, they're going to be very open to different types of cards besides just baseball or football or basketball. Golf cards are taking off. Right now, Tiger Woods cards are skyrocketing in prices. His autograph cards have gone up so much and have been all over, YouTube and all over the news, so much so that I think people are going to start looking at golf cards as a viable option. So movie and TV show and, non-sport cards, I think that they're going to do fairly well. I also think golf is going to do fairly well. And hockey, I think it's more about the media contract. If they can get latched back on with like an ESPN and be regularly in front of the United States audience, I think they have a chance at getting there too. Where will future collectors come from? And will interest in cards from the 50s and 60s decline because the players of that era will no longer hold the same interest to younger collectors that they did of those of us who lived through that era? So I think this is a really good question. I remember I was at a garage sale one time. I like garage sailing. And you remember those little figurines that were called Hummels? They were like little statues. The guy said, yeah, those things used to be so valuable, and now I can't give them away, and I'm asking like $3 each. He said, everyone who wanted those is dead. And that was an interesting thought. That's true. If everybody who has a demand for an item is dead, will the item have any value? I don't think that's the case with vintage cards, and here's why. The Generation X, right? The 70s and 80s born kids. When we collected cards, we wanted Mickey Mantle cards. We wanted Ernie Banks cards and Hank Aaron's and Willie Mays' and Ty Cobb's and Cy Young's and Christy Mathewson's. We wanted those cards, but we couldn't afford them. So we already have an interest in those. T206 cards. A T206 Ty Cobb card is $4,000 or $5,000. Very few people that are collecting those saw Ty Cobb play, but they still want a Ty Cobb card. See, the thing about us guys, we love sports, we love history, and we like learning about the history of a sport and investigating it. And we like reading books and reading articles and watching shows to learn about some of those past greats. So I want a Ty Cobb card. Never saw him play. I want a Cy Young card. Never saw him play. I want a Mickey Mantle card. Never saw him play. I think the demand is going nowhere. I think that people will continue to want those cards. I have Hall of Fame basketball cards from the 1961 and 1969 sets. Is it worth grading them at SGC? I have heard PSA and SGC are not giving high grades. Is that true? So this one's a really tough question because there's so many parts to this. First, to the 61 basketball cards, yeah, if there's a Hall of Famer and it's in, I mean, even if it's not in good condition, those cards are probably worth grading. And the reason I think they're worth grading is because when a card is graded, it's much more easy to sell it. It's so much more liquid because people across the country are comfortable buying a card online with a grade because it gives them a pretty darn good idea of the condition of the card. If it's not graded, you don't really know what you're getting. You don't know if there are creases or wrinkles or stains or if it's been trimmed. But by getting them graded, it's been authenticated, and it gives you, even if you don't always agree with the grade, it gives you a pretty good idea on the condition. So the 61s I would definitely grade. Depending on who we're talking about in the 69s, yes, I would grade those too. Now, when we say Hall of Famers, you know, Wes Unseld's rookie is that year. And Wes Unseld's rookie in a 2 isn't really worth that much. But if it's a decent condition, like a 5 or 6 or 7, I would grade it. So I would say the 61s, if they're a Hall of Famer, I'd grade them. The 69s, I would probably grade if it's a high-end player, like certainly a Lou Alcindor. But if it's a lower-end Hall of Famer, I would if it was in decent condition. Regarding PSA doing population control, I know there's been people that feel that way. I think personally, it's more about this. It's more about SGC and PSA seem to be grading a little bit harder. So it feels like they're not giving high grades anymore because I don't know if they're giving high grades. But are they doing that to reduce the population? Maybe. But I don't think that they're sitting there with a list and they're looking at the pop reports when they give a grade. So I don't think that's what's happening. What should I do with the thousands of beaten up cards of mostly no-name players? Should I donate them to a charity in my hometown? This one is a harder one. This is more like depends. When we say that there are thousands of cards, if we're talking about 58s and 59s and 52s, then I wouldn't get rid of them regardless of the condition. If we're talking about 87, 88, 92, and they're beat up, I would probably consider doing something with them besides holding on to them still, because I think it would be a very long time until those had much value. But if we have cards from the 50s and 60s or even early 70s, and they're just sitting around and they're just mostly commons, I mean, it kind of also depends on what kind of space do you have. Like, do you have room in your attic to stick a couple of boxes in there? And then it's like, well, you're not really out anything by keeping them. You know, a lot of people are getting back into set building. And so some of these cards have value. And if they're in decent condition, you know, and they're building sets, then I think there could still be some value there. So kind of depends on the years we're talking about. If it's old, I'd probably hold on to it. If it's newer, I probably wouldn't. As far as donating it, now, I always think that stuff like that is cool. You know, whether it's money or cards or items, anything you could do to help other people, I think is a great thing. I was in the hospital several times as a kid. I had meningitis. I had multiple operations on different things. I was in the hospital quite a bit. And if somebody came in and dropped off some sports cards for me to go through when I was a kid in the hospital, I would have thought that was pretty cool. So if you're thinking about getting rid of them, I think that's a pretty cool option. Maybe even drop them off, if not at a hospital, to a local school and see if there's a teacher that wants them to maybe distribute them as prizes to their students. But it kind of depends on what we're talking about with the answer for that one. All right, so if you have questions for me for next week, leave them in the comments below. Looking forward to it.